What this poor bride found out about her 82-year-old millionaire husband will shock you. The grand estate loomed in the distance, its towering gates creaking open as Emma clutched her suitcase tighter, her knuckles whitening against the leather handle. Her reflection caught in the polished window of the car, a pale young woman with stormy blue eyes that betrayed the trepidation coursing through her veins. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, but its beauty felt out of reach, overshadowed by the decisions that had led her here. "Nervous, ma'am?" the chauffeur asked, breaking the silence. Emma managed a weak smile in the rearview mirror. "A bit, yes." But nervous didn't even begin to describe the maelstrom within her. She was a struggling artist from a quiet corner of New Hampshire, brought here by a whirlwind romance with Charles Blackwood, a dashing, impossibly wealthy 82-year-old industrialist whose charm had swept her off her feet. The man's silver hair and sharp wit had been mesmerizing, a stark contrast to the mundane life she'd once known. Yet, as the car wound through the pristine driveway, bordered by perfectly trimmed hedges, an unease she couldn't quite place took root. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind. "A man like that doesn't marry a young woman without a reason, Emma. Be careful." She had laughed it off then. After all, Charles had been nothing but kind and generous. But now, as she approached the foreboding mansion with its tall windows and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, doubt began to gnaw at her resolve. The driver pulled up to the grand entrance, and the butler, a somber man in his late 60s, greeted her with a polite bow. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, Mrs. Blackwood," he said. The title sent a shiver through her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady but thin. As the doors swung open, revealing the cavernous foyer adorned with crystal chandeliers and oil paintings that seemed to watch her every move, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale. It was something else entirely. Emma never thought she'd find herself in the orbit of someone like Charles Blackwood. Just a year ago, her life had been a quiet struggle, painting watercolors in a small, dim studio above a cafe. She'd scraped together a modest income selling pieces at weekend art markets, supplementing it with part-time work as a waitress. Her days were long and unremarkable, her nights spent dreaming of gallery showings and escaping the confines of her small town. Then came Charles. She had met him at an art event in Boston, where she'd reluctantly accepted a free ticket handed out by a fellow artist. Emma's work had barely caught the attention of the room, overshadowed by more seasoned names. Charles had stood out immediately. Distinguished and confident, he moved through the space with the ease of someone who owned not just the room but the world itself. She'd been startled when he stopped at her small corner display, his silver eyebrows raised as he studied her paintings. "Your work," he said, "is raw. Honest. You have talent." Emma had stammered out a thank you, feeling out of place under his piercing gaze. What followed felt like a fairy tale. Charles had returned again and again, inviting her to dinners, speaking about art and life with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. Though she'd initially hesitated, aware of their stark differences in age and status, his persistence melted her walls. What had truly won her over wasn't the wealth, nor the expensive gifts he lavished on her. It was how he seemed genuinely interested in her dreams, her ambitions. He'd even funded her first gallery showing, an event that had been the highlight of her otherwise modest career. When he proposed 3 months ago, the ring glittering in a box that could have paid her rent for years, Emma had said yes. But now, standing in the shadow of Blackwood Manor, she wasn't sure if it had been love or the weight of his generosity that had compelled her answer. There were whispers she tried to ignore, Charles's past wives, the quiet scandals no one dared to discuss openly. Those whispers had a way of creeping into her thoughts now, especially in the vast, hollow grandeur of his world. Emma's first night in Blackwood Manor should have been a celebration of her new life, but instead, it became the moment everything began to unravel. The grand dining hall stretched endlessly, its long table set with gleaming silverware and polished crystal that reflected the flickering light of the chandelier above. Charles sat at the head, dressed in a tailored navy suit, every inch the commanding presence she'd come to know. But tonight, there was an edge to his charm, a sharpness in his gaze that made her stomach tighten. The dinner began uneventfully, with the butler, Mr. Calloway, serving a delicate soup Emma couldn't even bring herself to taste. The conversation was polite but shallow. Charles talked about business, names, and deals she didn't recognize. She nodded and smiled, but the weight of the mansion pressed down on her. Every movement echoed, every shadow seemed alive. Halfway through the meal, Emma dared to ask the question that had been gnawing at her since she'd arrived. "Charles," she began softly, setting down her fork. "I've been meaning to ask about your family. Your late wife." The room seemed to freeze. Charles's expression didn't falter, but his grip on his glass tightened just enough for Emma to notice. "Why do you ask?" His tone was calm, but there was a warning in it, like a blade concealed beneath silk. Emma hesitated. I realized I didn't know much about her. Or about them. I'd like to know more about the life I'm stepping into." Charles's lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "My late wife, Lillian, was a beautiful woman. Intelligent, elegant. But she was also fragile. This house, this life, can be overwhelming for some." Emma noticed Mr. Calloway shift uncomfortably in the corner of her vision, but she pressed on. "And your other wife?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles's smile vanished. He set his glass down with a deliberate slowness, the sound echoing in the vast room. "Emma," he said, his tone now cold, "there are things about my past that are better left undisturbed. I thought you understood that." She shrank under his gaze, but before she could apologize, the sound of shattering glass startled her. Emma turned to see Mr. Calloway, pale as a sheet, staring at the floor where he'd dropped the wine decanter. "Clumsy fool," Charles muttered, his voice low but venomous. "Clean it up." As the butler scrambled to obey, Emma's unease deepened. The exchange, brief as it was, felt like a glimpse behind the carefully curated mask Charles wore. Later that night, Emma wandered the halls, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. She passed door after locked door, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light. One door in particular caught her eye. It was different, reinforced with a heavy lock. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wood, when a voice behind her made her jump. "Some doors are better left closed, my dear," Charles said, his voice smooth but heavy with implication. Emma turned to see him standing in the shadowed hallway, his presence both commanding and suffocating. Her heart raced as he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "This is your home now," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But there are rules. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her throat dry. "Yes." But as he walked away, leaving her alone in the dim corridor, the unease that had taken root in her chest grew. For the first time, Emma felt like a guest in her own life, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Charles Blackwood was hiding something that could shatter the fragile world she'd stepped into. The days at Blackwood Manor passed in an unsettling blur. Emma found herself navigating a maze of opulence, where the grandeur of her surroundings did little to soothe the gnawing unease that had taken root. The house was beautiful but cold, its sprawling halls and grand chambers feeling more like a gilded cage than a home. The staff was polite, almost overly so, but distant, their eyes averted whenever Emma tried to engage them in conversation. Charles, for his part, maintained a meticulous balance between charm and control. He lavished her with gifts and spoke to her with a tenderness that could disarm her doubts, but his moments of intensity, sharp, almost imperceptible warnings tucked into his words, kept her on edge. And then there were the rules. Stay away from the West Wing. Avoid the locked doors. Never question the past. These restrictions hovered over Emma like invisible chains, and the more she tried to ignore them, the heavier they seemed to weigh. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the tall windows of the drawing room, Emma sat with a cup of tea, attempting to lose herself in a book. But her focus was broken by the faint sound of voices echoing from the West Wing. She set the book down and tilted her head, straining to listen. The voices were muffled but tense, rising and falling in what sounded like an argument. One voice was unmistakably Charles's, firm and commanding, but the other was softer, almost pleading. Emma's curiosity burned. Abandoning her tea, she slipped out of the room and down the hall, her footsteps light against the polished floors. As she approached the west wing, the voices became clearer. "You've overstepped," Charles's voice cut through the air, low but with a razor-sharp edge. I only thought it would help," the other voice replied, trembling. Emma pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. Before she could catch more, the sound of approaching footsteps sent her scurrying back the way she came. She darted into the library, sinking into a chair and pretending to read just as Charles entered the room. His eyes swept over her, narrowing slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he crossed the room to a globe, spun it idly, and spoke in an almost casual tone. "Is everything all right, Emma?" She forced a smile. "Of course. Just enjoying some quiet time." He nodded but lingered, his gaze heavy and searching. After what felt like an eternity, he left, and Emma exhaled, her chest tight with suppressed fear. The West Wing, she decided, held more than locked doors. It held secrets, ones she was now determined to uncover. Over the next week, Emma began exploring the manor in earnest. She told herself it was idle curiosity, an attempt to familiarize herself with her new home, but in truth, it was more than that. She wanted answers. About the locked doors, about Charles's past, about the uneasy feeling that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. One afternoon, while wandering through a less traveled hallway, Emma stumbled upon a small, dusty study. The door had been ajar as if inviting her in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books and varnished wood. A large oak desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers, ledgers, and a leather-bound journal that seemed out of place amid the chaos. Emma hesitated, her fingers hovering over the journal. Then, with a glance over her shoulder, she opened it. The first few pages were innocuous enough, notes about business dealings and estate matters. But as she flipped further, the entries grew darker. There were mentions of Lillian, Charles's late wife, and cryptic references to the strain of her weakness and the necessity of control. Emma's pulse quickened as she read an entry dated only a year before. Lillian's unpredictability jeopardized everything. Her removal was regrettable but essential. Stability must be maintained at all costs. The word sent a chill down her spine. She slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into place, her hands trembling. Removal? What did that mean? Before she could process further, the sound of footsteps in the hall made her heart leap. She darted behind a heavy curtain just as Charles entered the study. He moved to the desk, his movements deliberate. Emma held her breath, willing herself invisible as he scanned the room. After a moment, he sighed, picked up the journal, and left, closing the door behind him. Emma stayed frozen for several minutes before finally emerging, her legs shaky beneath her. That evening, Emma confronted Charles over dinner. The dining table felt longer than ever, the space between them an abyss. She gripped her fork tightly, her voice steady but edged with resolve. "Charles, I came across a study today. It seemed private." He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Did you know?" "Yes. And I found something. A journal." She searched his face for a reaction, but he remained infuriatingly calm. There were entries about Lillian. About her removal. Charles set his wine glass down with a soft clink. "You've been prying where you shouldn't, Emma." His voice was calm, but there was a steely undertone that made her skin crawl. "I have a right to know," she shot back, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm your wife now. If there are things about this house, about your past, that could affect me, I deserve to know." For a moment, Charles said nothing, his gaze locked onto hers. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There are things in this world, my dear, that are better left untouched. I suggest you remember that." The conversation ended there, but Emma's resolve only hardened. Charles's refusal to explain, to even acknowledge her concerns, made it clear that whatever he was hiding, it was far more dangerous than she'd imagined. Emma began to notice other oddities. The way the staff avoided certain areas of the house. The way Charles's mood darkened whenever she pressed him for details. The whispers she caught in the halls late at night. One evening, while wandering the grounds, she found an overgrown garden tucked behind the manor. At its center was a small, crumbling mausoleum. The name Lillian Blackwood was etched into the stone, but the date of death was obscured by moss and weathering. As she stood there, a faint breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it a chill that made her shiver. Back inside, Emma pieced together what little she knew. Charles's control over the house was absolute. The staff was either loyal to him or too frightened to cross him. And the West Wing, the locked doors, the strange voices, held answers she couldn't ignore. Late one night, Emma decided to act. Armed with a small flashlight and her pounding with both fear and determination, she made her way toward the West Wing. The door was locked, as always, but she'd swiped a key from Mr. Calloway earlier that day. She slid it into the lock, her breath hitching as the mechanism clicked. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with doors. Emma stepped inside, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The air was colder here, heavier. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. One door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar. Emma approached it, her pulse thundering in her ears. As she pushed it open, the sight before her made her blood run cold. Inside was a room filled with portraits, all of them of women. Women who looked strikingly similar to Lillian. And to her. Beneath each portrait was a brass plaque engraved with a name and a date. The date spanned decades. Emma's knees nearly buckled as she backed away, the flashlight trembling in her hand. She turned to flee, but the sound of footsteps behind her stopped her cold. "I warned you, Emma," Charles's voice echoed, smooth and chilling. "Some doors are better left closed." Emma's heart pounded as Charles stepped into the dimly lit room, his presence filling the space like a suffocating fog. The flashlight trembled in her hand, casting jagged beams of light onto the portraits that lined the walls. Their faces stared back at her, frozen in time, each woman bearing an eerie resemblance to herself. "You weren't supposed to see this," Charles said softly, his voice devoid of its usual charm. It was calm, measured, and laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. He stepped closer, the shadows stretching and curling around him like living things. "This is why I told you not to pry." Emma backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who are they?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What is this?" Charles tilted his head, studying her as though she were a problem to be solved. "They were my wives," he said, almost casually, as if discussing an old collection of books. "Each of them is remarkable in their way. Beautiful. Talented. But flawed." The word sent a shiver down Emma's spine. "Flawed," she repeated, her voice trembling. "They couldn't handle this life," Charles continued, his gaze drifting toward the nearest portrait. "The expectations. The responsibilities. They grew weak. Unstable. And I had to ensure the stability of my legacy." Emma's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. "What did you do to them?" Charles's eyes snapped back to her, sharp and unyielding. "I did what was necessary. I preserved the order. For the house, for the estate. For myself." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. Her stomach churned, and bile rose in her throat. "You killed them," she whispered, the realization chilling her to the core. Charles didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. "Emma, you're different," he said, his tone softening. "I chose you because I saw something in you, strength, resilience. You're not like them. You can thrive here if only you'd stop questioning everything and accept your place." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'll never be a part of this," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Whatever this is, it's sick. It's wrong. I'm leaving. Charles's expression hardened, the softness evaporating like a mist burned away by the sun. You think it's that simple? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. You can't leave, Emma. You're mine now. You agreed to this. Emma took another step back, her shoulders pressing against the cold wall. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, for a way out of the nightmare that had ensnared her. You don't own me, she said, her voice firmer now. And I'm not staying here to be another portrait on this wall. Charles's gaze darkened, and he advanced on her. You misunderstand, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. This isn't about ownership. This is about survival. Yours. Mine. The house demands balance. Before she could comprehend his words, Emma's hand brushed against a brass candlestick on a nearby table. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung, the heavy object connecting with Charles's temple with a sickening thud. He staggered, a look of shock flashing across his face as he collapsed to the floor. Emma didn't wait to see if he would get back up. She bolted from the room, her bare feet pounding against the cold floor as she fled down the corridor. The house seemed to close in around her, its shadows deepening, its walls narrowing, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare. Bursting into the foyer, Emma threw open the massive front doors and stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, and she didn't stop running until the lights of Blackwood Manor disappeared behind her. Only then did she collapse onto the damp grass, her chest heaving, her body trembling with adrenaline and terror. She didn't know where she would go or how she would escape Charles's reach, but one thing was certain, she would never set foot in that house again. The air was sharp and cold as Emma trudged through the woods surrounding Blackwood Manor, the darkness swallowing her whole. Her body was trembling, a mix of fear, exhaustion, and adrenaline coursing through her veins. The memory of Charles's lifeless form sprawled on the study floor replayed in her mind, a ghostly echo she couldn't shake. She didn't stop moving, not even when her legs felt like giving out. Somewhere deep within her, a voice whispered that stopping meant death. Eventually, she reached the road, its gravel biting into her bare feet. A pair of headlights pierced the gloom in the distance, and Emma stumbled into the center of the lane, waving her arms frantically. The car screeched to a halt, the driver jumping out, shouting in alarm. "Help me," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "Please." The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, wrapped a blanket around Emma and helped her into the car. She didn't ask too many questions, sensing the raw fear in Emma's trembling frame. Emma only managed to mutter the name of the nearest town before collapsing into the seat, her body giving in to exhaustion. The next few days were a blur. Emma found herself in a small motel room, its walls painted a faded yellow that felt oddly comforting in its normalcy. The motel manager, an older man named Frank, had offered her a place to stay without prying too much into her story. She could barely sleep, her mind racing with what she had uncovered at Blackwood Manor. The portraits, the journal, the cryptic words about balance and survival. None of it made sense, yet it all felt terrifyingly real. She spent hours on her phone, searching for anything about Charles Blackwood's past. Articles about his business empire were plentiful, but mentions of his personal life were sparse. The few details she found only deepened her unease, a series of wives who had all died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths attributed to accidents, illnesses, or vague causes. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they refused to fit together neatly. Determined to bring the truth to light, Emma reached out to a journalist she remembered from a local paper. His name was Paul Grayson, and his articles had always dug deeper than most, exposing corruption and scandals in the area. When she called, her voice shaking as she explained what she had seen, he agreed to meet her immediately. Paul listened intently as Emma recounted everything, the locked doors, the portraits, the journal, and her final confrontation with Charles. His face grew darker with every word, his pen scribbling furiously in a notebook. "If even half of what you're saying is true," he said finally, "this could be the story of the decade. But we need evidence. Real evidence." Emma hesitated. The journal, she said. Charles took it, but it has everything. If we could get back into the manor. Paul shook his head. That's too dangerous. Blackwood's estate is locked down, and if he's alive, he won't hesitate to stop you. A cold chill ran through Emma at the thought of Charles still breathing, still hunting. But Paul's words only strengthened her resolve. We have to try, she said. People need to know what he's done. With Paul's help, Emma gathered what little evidence she had, photographs she had taken of the mausoleum and the portraits before her hasty escape. Paul began digging into Charles's financial records and connections, uncovering a network of suspicious dealings that hinted at a man willing to do anything to maintain his power. Their investigation culminated in a daring decision. Paul would confront Blackwood's empire publicly, using the media as a weapon. The exposé hit the front page of major papers within weeks, detailing the mysterious deaths of Charles's wives, the eerie patterns in his marriages, and Emma's chilling testimony. Public outrage erupted, forcing law enforcement to act. The police raided Blackwood Manor, uncovering what Emma had feared but couldn't fully articulate. The portraits, the journal, and a series of hidden rooms filled with damning evidence painted Charles as a man who viewed people as pawns in his twisted pursuit of control. But Charles himself was nowhere to be found. The house was empty, its secrets laid bare, but its master vanished like a shadow. Months later, Emma sat in a sunlit cafe, sipping tea and watching the world pass by. Her life was far from perfect, but it was her own again. The story of Blackwood Manor had made national headlines, and though justice felt incomplete without Charles's capture, Emma took solace in knowing the truth was out. His empire was crumbling, his influence waning. Paul had stayed in touch, becoming both an ally and a friend. He had encouraged her to tell her story fully, and while it had been painful, Emma found a measure of catharsis in speaking out. She had learned to reclaim her voice, to shed the fears that had once silenced her. As she left the cafe that afternoon, the sunlight warming her skin, Emma paused to glance at her reflection in the window. For the first time in what felt like years, she saw herself, not the frightened woman who had fled Blackwood Manor, but someone stronger. Someone who had faced the darkness and refused to be consumed by it. The past would always linger, a shadow at the edges of her life. But Emma knew now that she was no longer a prisoner of it. She had escaped the mansion, escaped Charles's grasp, and reclaimed her future. And for that, she was grateful.